The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Some Words of President Wilson About Religion. One of the things I enjoy most during my downtime is to go antique shopping. I'll find an antique mall and just spend a great deal of time in there. I have a number of things that I like to collect, not the least of which is old things that relate to religion. I did not find this particular pamphlet. Beth found it and got it for me. It's called Some Words of President Wilson About Religion. It's a pamphlet that was put out by the YMCA in 1918. It's 100 years old. There's a number of things to talk about here. I'm going to go through some of what President Wilson actually says about religion, although that's not the purpose of this video. And I'm probably going to talk a little bit about the YMCA, and that's also not the purpose of this video. The YMCA is something that would probably deserve its own video. It has such peculiar beginnings, founded in England based on a notion, an idea of something that I don't think is even realistically expressed anymore, which is muscular Christianity. And it's something that encouraged patriotism and manliness, and among other things, the expulsion of all that is effeminate and or excessively intellectual, which I found just really intriguing. Now, it's funny, there's a Young Men's Christians Association, that's YMCA, and now it's commonly just referred to as the Y. There was also YWCA. They were definitely religiously focused in their beginnings. That did not necessarily continue forever, but around 100 years ago in 1918, this is what the YMCA was doing, essentially putting out this little pamphlet from President Wilson about religion. Now, President Woodrow Wilson, he was in his second term. We were at war when this was released, although we were in the last year of World War I. And my concern here is, how does this not violate the issues of church-state separation, the separation of religion and government? Does it? Should it? Should it have? Do we care? I mean, are we just going to go with the West Wing quote of, sometimes you say what the heck and carry on? This video is actually about the separation of religion and government. So for the sake of nostalgia, I'm going to read you some of what President Wilson wrote in here. There's somebody out there who's throwing a fit saying this is 100 years old, you should have gloves. It's not in the best shape. I'm hoping to find one that's in a better shape. And I'm sure there are many, many copies of this out there. But I want to read what was written here so that people can see that a lot of what we deal with is not at all new. I know that's not a surprise, but it's the truth. From President Wilson on religion. There was a time which we can all remember when men of science were actually content with a certain materialistic conception of the universe. Their antagonistic position with regard to spiritual matters was not a defiant position. It was a position of self-assurance and self-content. They did not look into such matters because they were convinced that it was vain to look into them, that there was nothing that would come of their examination of the secret motives, of the secret springs of actions among men, of the secret source of life in the world itself. But that time has gone by. Even men of science now feel that the explanation which they give of the universe is so partial an explanation, so incomplete an explanation, that for the benefit of their own thought, quite aside from the benefit of their own souls, it is necessary that something should be added to it. They know that there is a spiritual segment in the complete circle of knowledge which they cannot supply, and which must be supplied if the whole circle is not to show its imperfections and incompleteness. Now, this is the opening page from President Wilson. He goes on to cover a great many things, but as I pointed out, this isn't about what President Wilson had to say. He talks about the Bible. The Bible's the word of life. This is not just a general view of, the scientists thought they knew everything, and yet we know that there's more to it. This really is a number of appeals about linking patriotism to religion. He says, there are great problems before the American people. There are problems which will need purity of spirit and an integrity of purpose, such as have never been called for before in the history of this country. I should be afraid to go forward if I did not believe that there lay at the foundation of all our schooling and of all our thought this incomparable and unimpeachable Word of God. There's a lot here, and it makes sense that something like this might have been published. It's just strange. And I'm not going to pretend to be a legal expert at all. I have friends who are legal experts. Hopefully some of them will actually see this and comment, because I think that there are aspects of this pamphlet which may well violate the principles of church-state separation, which I'm in favor of referring to as the separation of religion and government rather than church-state separation. Amanda Knief convinced me of that, and I think she's correct. But when in our modern world, now 100 years after President Wilson's comments on religion, we look around and we see things and we're wondering, is this a violation of the principles of church-state separation? Is it okay for somebody to have a prayer meeting in their school? Is it okay for somebody to pray publicly? When you're an elected official, don't you have to check your religion at the door? And the truth is, no, you don't have to check your religion at the door. You still have the same religious freedoms that anybody else has. If you're elected to public office, be it president, governor, mayor, state board of education, whatever, there's no requirement that you have to shut up about your religion or that you have to check your religion at the door. The requirement, kind of carved out over the course of a number of First Amendment cases, is that you do not get to use your office, your official position, to promote religion. Hang on, this says some words of President Wilson about religion. How is this not a violation? Clearly, here we have the President of the United States in his official capacity in the final year of a war, working with the Young Men's Christian Association to put together a pamphlet about patriotism and about appealing to God and the Word of God and Christianity and how science thought it had all the answers, but it doesn't. How is this not essentially just the President of the United States in his official capacity preaching Christianity to the world? Well, in some sense it is. It's the sort of thing that is completely unsurprising. We've entered into a war. We have changed our mentality. We want to encourage people. An overwhelming majority of people are religious, and most of them being Christian. And it's not like we had a number of secular societies who were actively and vocally challenging these sorts of things. If I had a pamphlet here that was from 2018, some words of President Trump about religion, the case might be slightly different. And I don't want to make an appeal to nostalgia, because we saw that in the Ten Commandments cases from 2004, 2005, where they essentially invented a grandfather clause. So I'm not aware of an easy answer as to whether or not this should qualify as a violation of the principles of separation of church and state. I think that it should. I think that the biggest problem is that we're looking back 100 years at this. But I raise this today to let people know that, first of all, this stuff's been going on. And to hearken back to that Supreme Court case, which I've discussed recently with Jeff Blackwell and others, where I think it was Justice Breyer essentially invented a grandfather clause saying the Ten Commandments monument in Texas could stay because nobody had complained about it, and the Ten Commandments in Kentucky had to go because they'd been complaining about it was new and blah, blah, blah. It's a ridiculous standard, but what it taught us was we need to complain. And if we had had that sort of ruling prior to 1918, there may have been people who could have complained about this. On the other hand, they were involved in World War I, and sometimes there are bigger issues to focus on. It doesn't mean that there aren't issues worth addressing. This is one of the things I see quite frequently, where someone has a pet issue and it becomes the all-consuming issue for them. Michael Newdow has sued I don't know how many times to remove "In God We Trust" from our money, and I support the idea of removing it. I just don't support the idea of the method that has in the past gone about it. There's a time and a place to build up a pool of political capital to use strategically. And when you're spending your time going after something that is ultimately pretty trivial, I mean, in my entire time as a fundamentalist Christian, there were maybe 2 instances where somebody ever referenced "In God We Trust" on the money as if it were somehow relevant. It does foster this notion that we are a Christian nation when we're not. it is worth objecting to, and ultimately it's something that I'd like to see changed. I'd also like to see the national motto changed and changed back from "In God We Trust" to "E Pluribus Unum." It's a much better motto. We don't actually all trust in God, but the ideal behind the United States is "out of many one," the forming of a union to create a more perfect union. All of these things, it was a beautiful motto. Maybe because it was Latin, it was much easier for people to just dismiss, that's too old. Maybe we need an English version of it. But when we look around the world, I want to encourage people that when you think you see something that is, in your opinion, likely to be a violation of the separation of religion and government, that you reach out to the organizations that specialize in those cases, give them your information. Most of them will be happy to talk to you, or at least consider this. Some of them will be able to explain why you are in fact incorrect. And others will be able to tell you whether or not it's something that we can strategically work for. So when you take public office, you don't have to check your religion at the door. But if you're doing what Rick Perry did, which is calling, the National Day of Prayer is incredibly problematic, and we've protested it. But when you call for a day of prayer because Texas is in a drought and they need rain, it's okay for the governor to attend a prayer meeting, a prayer breakfast, to engage in his religious activities, to speak openly about it. But if in their capacity as governor, they dictate to their constituents, you are to pray, it doesn't matter that it's ultimately unenforceable. The governor, the president, nobody can force me to pray. You can stand here with a gun to my head and I can mouth words, but you're never going to force me to pray. So that's not what this is. The objection on the separation of religion and government grounds is that this unduly favors religion over non-religion, or a particular religion over other religions, which is how the Supreme Court has decided what does and doesn't qualify as a violation of the First Amendment. At some point, I'll come back and do a video about the YMCA and muscular Christianity, which is fun because it's undeniable that the modern YMCA probably does a lot of good for a lot of people. And we can say the same thing about other religious organizations as well. That's completely separate from whether or not they should be promoted by the President of the United States in their official capacity. A few other selections from President Wilson. The New Testament is the history of the life of Jesus Christ and the testimony of common men who rallied to his fellowship and who by their faith and preaching remade a world that was under thrall of the Roman army. There's a number of different army and war themes in here, not surprising given when this was published. I am sorry for the men who do not read the Bible every day. I wonder why they deprive themselves of the strength and of the pleasure. It is one of the most singular books in the world. For every time you open it, some old text that you've read a score of times suddenly beams with a new meaning. Evidently, the moods and the thoughts of the day, bred by the circumstances that you cannot analyze, have suddenly thrown their light upon that page and upon that passage, and there springs out upon the page to you something that you never saw lie upon it before. Well, and the good news, President Wilson is basically acknowledging that the Bible is what you make of it, that you can read a passage many, many times, and until you are in a particular circumstance, you don't see a particular message, which is all about us reading into it what we think we want to hear, rather than addressing what it actually says. So in 1918, was this a violation of the First Amendment? Maybe. It's really difficult. And because these things, this pamphlet has fallen into the past. You can find pictures of it, and you will probably somewhere find the full text of it from a Google search. But it's in an antique store. It's not being used by churches. I see no reason why any new YMCA organization would republish what a president from 100 years ago said, because it's not really that relevant to us now. So when we look around, there are egregious violations that focus on people's civil rights. And it's a mistake to say, let's only focus on the biggest problem. It's actually a fallacy we've talked about several times in the past, which is the fallacy of relative privation, which is that we should only spend our effort on the thing that is most significant. We shouldn't be researching a cure for athlete's foot when we should be researching a cure for cancer. It's fallacious for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we can do more than one thing. But when we figure out what people are doing on behalf of their religion and try to decide whether or not this violates the principles. We have to look at the established court law. We have to look at the precedent that's been set. And there are people who are experts in this. The American Atheist Organization, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ACLU, Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Don't immediately assume that just because you come across something that you think is a violation of separation of religion and government, that it is. But also, don't just go, I'm probably wrong, there's nothing to see here. Because if religion is being included into your public schools, if your local officials are acting clearly in their official capacity as elected officials to promote and further religion over non-religion or specific religions over other religions, those things are very likely violations and they need to be addressed. And one of the key things to addressing them is having a plaintiff, having a complainant to bring forth the case. Because quite often these issues are settled on whether or not somebody has standing. Let's throw it out. You don't have a cause for complaint. You haven't been wronged in any way. It may be the case that many of these infractions are never going to be settled. But there are many people in those organizations that I listed that are working to set forward the best strategic case to address these sorts of things. They require that people come forward and say, hey, what about this issue? What about this issue? I think this may be an issue, in order to figure out not only which issues need to be addressed, but how to better educate and communicate with people about which issues need to be addressed so that the information that they get is better every time. Now, I don't know if I'll actually do a video on the YMCA, but it's been fun to read through this pamphlet from President Wilson, where he talks about the Bible, he talks about Christianity, he talks about prayer, he talks about Jesus. 100 years old, 1918, in the final year of World War I, some words of President Wilson about religion, which may well have been a violation of the separation of religion and government if we'd had better precedent and secular organizations at the time to address it. Now, having said that, do I think that it would have been a good idea in 1918 for secular organizations to chastise and go after the president for putting forward this pamphlet for the YMCA? Probably not, or at least not in a serious sense or a significant sense. Probably the best thing to do would have been to make people aware that it is likely a violation of the First Amendment for the president in his official capacity to be so vehemently supporting of religion and working with an expressly religious organization, at least at the time, so that we didn't have the parade of First Amendment violations that followed this. For me, I'm just really happy to have this, to put it in my collection, to be able to look back on the way things were 100 years ago and realize that we're fighting some of the same battles, but I'm optimistic that we are better at fighting those battles than we have been in the past. So if you think you see a violation, contact one of those organizations. I'm sure that we can all work together to educate people about what is and is not a violation and to fundamentally change the laws so that we don't see such blatant religious privilege. The last note on this is, I doubt this sent any money in the direction of churches. As a matter of fact, it probably cost them money. This is probably akin to the sort of thing that religious organizations would send out to the troops. That's going to prompt a discussion about chaplains in the military, which we'll have to do another time. But thanks for this week, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.